All right, we're moving on in Gilgamesh to the fourth tablet as Gilgamesh and Enkidu get ready for their journey up to the cedar forest in Lebanon in order to fight Humbaba. And they headed west out into the desert where they picked up the old caravan route, earth texture shifting constantly from sandy stretches and gravelly heaths to shrub and thistle-coated wastelands with cracked dry wadis that lay open and bleached by the sun every few miles. The stones changed color from white flint to smooth orange to round black ones the size of pigeons' eggs. They would stop to water their donkeys at muddy tarns and refilled their skins at wells dug 6 feet down into the brown earth, edges lined with mottled stones. The nights were cold, and they pitched tents made out of goat's hair cloth and lit burning eggs of fire inside them, and in the raw reddened air of dawn they would hang their frozen bedding up to watch it drip dry while the wind blew down from the northwest, freezing their fingers and faces. One night Gilgamesh had a nightmare of an enormous mountain shoving itself up out of the earth with a giant atop it, about to topple over onto him, and he awoke terrified, and Enkidu told him he was merely dreaming of Humbaba, and he sprinkled a circle of white flour around him, and then another layer of black flour, and the dreams went away. And on the next night, as the sun melted into the horizon, Gilgamesh faced it and dug a hole into the earth, and poured water for the dead into it, and offered some flour while reciting the hymn his mother had taught him. "Ancestors, ghosts," he said, "father, grandfather, mother, grandmother, all you dead who dream eternally in Kur, I offer you water to assuage your thirst in honor of your memory. Intercede on my behalf before Namtar, and give to Ningish Zeta my sins. Carry them down to Kur and purify me in your name. Here is cool water for you to drink, while I remember your great deeds, when you were once amongst the living." After that, the bad dreams went away, and the land went on. A saltwater lake where the ground was covered with ulcerous incrustations of baked salt, where only thorny shrubs grew, and beyond the lake they could see a dim black mass. And as they approached, walking beside their donkeys like human shadows, the mass resolved into a thicket of slender palms with dusty fronds waving in the wind, where the trees hovered above a battered and ancient crumbling mud brick fortress inside the broken casing of the outer wall, a collection of pink huts and splintered walls, nestled in a thicket of palms, willows, and pomegranate trees, and nearby a sulfur spring pouring stinking water into a pool overgrown with reeds atop which a thin layer of green scum floated. They ate a handful of dates, then continued on across a ground marshy and wet with a series of springs that leaked green rivers of fetid water. The hooves of the donkeys sank into the mud and then pulled out with a sucking sound as they passed over a series of barren hills. The marsh dried out, and they came to another oasis of palms, where a village of peasants dwelled, some resting beneath the shade of the trees where they sold fish, dates, bread, fruit, and milk to passing travelers. And they paused for a while to watch a woman make butter. She was pouring hot milk into a sheepskin that hung from a wooden tripod over a flame, and then she began to sway the skin back and forth with a gentle churning motion until it curdled, and Enkidu was fascinated. Later they crossed a sunken wadi covered with a thin, fine layer of sand where tamarisk trees had struck roots deep down into the moisture below, and little cup-shaped depressions full of water gathered at their trunks. And here Enkidu pointed out that this was better water for them to drink, and later they came upon another sulfur spring that fed into a soggy pool, and the mound nearby was littered with broken teeth of ancient forgotten gravestone markers. They angled north, and the ground became black with dried pitch that had been deposited by sulphurous streams of brackish water. Half-congealed lakes of bitumen marred the land. But soon they were through this, and traversing bare hills of the plain, which now opened before them, they crossed another wadi covered with a crust of baked sulfur, and came to an outcrop of rock where a deep pool reflected the azurite sky in mirror image reversal. Later they aligned with the course of a shallow valley which collapsed in stages into yet another wadi, where the ruins of a huge masonry tank full of soil stood beside an ancient dam, now little more than a rubble heap of yellow stones. They began to approach the river Buranan, which angled to the west, cutting across their path, and the plain before them was broken by long gravelly ridges that marked the remains of disused irrigation canals. The ruins of old weirs and shattered dams lay strewn all about, while the dark green strip of the river, unvarnished by any vegetation, cut a meandering S shape across the land, and the soil here began to turn a glassy black, and upon the horizon there appeared a dark piece of color like mold that must have been a town. Mounds of black rubbish and cinders that looked as if it had all been forged once long ago in the bowels of a volcano began to litter the sulfur marshes along the outskirts of the town, which now delineated itself as a conical tumulus rising beside the river, packed with a density of palm trees. And there, hiding among those trees, was a series of long, low, flat-roofed buildings, the color of granite. Clouds of thick black smoke stained the air about the city with a grimy smear. "It is the town of It," Gilgamesh said as they approached it. "It is famous for its bitumen wells. We will sleep here tonight." Boats clustered near the docks, some with triangular lateen sails bobbing up and down, as men loaded them with heavy cakes of black bitumen, making neat piles upon palm leaves, the pitch fires of the asphalt burners circling the town like some level of hell. And they spewed forth a gritty, malodorous smoke as they approached the dusty town, where splotches of bitumen were visible everywhere in the crowded streets. They stabled their donkeys at a caravansary and retired to a dark, poorly lit tavern where rotting logs of wood held up a mud ceiling that bowed inwards as though it were about to collapse. And here they drank warm beer out of chipped cups of gray pottery while they sat on the floor upon piles of rugs, where they joined the other men who watched them with filmy yellow eyes. The desert went on interminably, the color of dried, arid grass, and it went for miles a landscape scarred with the ghosts of old canals and long-forgotten roads to the east. The monotony of the river was occasionally interrupted by palm-covered islands of rotting houses baking in the sun. Irregular patches of cultivation sliced up by canals marked places where little hamlets had taken form as a crust of square dwellings resembling geological formations. The islands in the river, long, narrow strips of bare khaki land surrounded by dark brown water, began to occur with more frequency after several days. They came upon a verdant oasis woven together out of palm trees and willows, where a small village of mud houses with logs poking out of them had taken root at a large island midstream, was emerald with date palms and brown with neat squares of cultivated barley. The traces of an old washed-out bridge that had once connected the island with the bank of the river were still visible, as a series of ruined piers, half sunken in the water. Fishermen in brown robes stood between these piers, where they placed nets in order to catch the fish as they poured down through the river's currents on the shore. A man was lifting water from the river with a shadoof and dumping it into a large clay jar below him. A thatch of dried and brittle palm fronds moved, and a man climbed out of a hole in the ground which had been covered by the palm leaves and stood staring at them as they shambled past. There came a sharp turn of the river, which surrounded a rocky hill on three sides by water. Atop this peninsula, the mud brick ruins of a collapsed building marked the hill as the site of some ancient fortification. On the ground nearby, there lay a series of salt-encrusted runnels, which indicated that the area had once been under cultivation, and they paused here for a midday meal, then moved on. They filed down through a deep winding gorge where the river ran over a series of rapids through a cleft, the vivid green palms on the opposite bank contrasting with the red cliffs. But these were the last of the palm trees, for after they had passed through this zone, they saw them no more. The land changed to a series of low downs intersected by ravines. The course of the river, hitherto east-west, now began to curve northwest, and the desert retreated from the edge of the water and was replaced by a carpet of green grass. They descended into a valley lined by cliffs and filled with pomegranate trees. There was a series of dikes and sluice gates controlling the flow of the water through the canals, and beyond them lay a humped ridge of earth where another large canal carried water off from the river. Farmers gazed at them resting on their hoes. Mulberry trees with shrieking magpies in them became dense as they came up the valley, and saw in the distance between the neatly ordered rows of trees and the cracked mud brick buildings perched at the edges of the river a strip of brown buildings of a small village where they rested for the night. The next day they traveled along a gravelly road that ran parallel to the river, where small cube-shaped houses with walls the color of yellow teeth pushed their way out of the earth. To the west, a line of greenish-yellow hills were hinged together by tamarisk trees. They passed marshes and lagoons full of ducks and geese, and then a tamarisk wood where each tree was growing out of its own mound of sand. There were barley fields interspersed with thorn bushes. As they traveled further north, the hills began slowly to erupt out of the ground at the periphery of the western horizon. At intervals, they would encounter a hill with a surface ruptured by gravestones, where the Martu had built a makeshift cemetery. Shards of broken blue and green pottery were scattered over these graves, which the Martu, Enkidu explained, had deliberately dug out of the earth for just this purpose. Indeed, it was becoming a regular occurrence for them to see Martu camps along the crests of distant hills, clusters of brown and black tents made out of goat's hair cloth, forming little humps, men clad in earth-colored robes, which covered them from head to toe like burial shrouds. And they were always hunched over cooking fires, roasting mutton and goat, and eating sour curds with their fingers out of bowls. On occasion, a shepherd would lead his flocks across their path. They came to the confluence of the Boranon with another river that flowed into it from the northeast. "It is the Hubor," Enkidu said, "the boundary which divides the world of the Martu from that of the city dweller to the north. We will find no more palm trees, for it is too cold, and if you travel along the Hubor that way, you will come to the mountains with their wild and dangerous tribes. From here on out, the tribes of the Martu will be common, and it is worth knowing that the tribes on that side of the river are always at war with those on this side. They are forever crossing back and forth over each other's territories, stealing donkeys, sheep, and cattle, although this is not the season of raids, which comes in the summer. We must be very, very careful, for they will attack us with little provocation." To the west, the earth had begun to develop a spinal dragon's backbone of small mountains, and a wind had begun to blow from the east, bitter with chill, and in the mornings it entered their tent with a sharp frost that made the air brittle and coated the dawn sun with a thin scum of frost. After a time, the river sank into a narrow defile between steep rocky hills, which sloped down almost to the water's edge. At the top of one of these hills lay the ruins of a huge wall that had been assembled from blocks of hewn basalt stuck together with mortar. Further down the opposite slope of the hill had sprouted a collection of Martu tents, and as they passed, they watched while women were attempting to wean lambs from their mothers. Several miles further on, they could make out the hunched shape of an extinct volcano, the slopes of which were covered with a swale of blue irises. They came to an area where the ground was full of tiny cup-shaped holes, and a group of peasants were down on their knees digging into them, as if searching furtively, and when Gilgamesh asked Enkidu what they were doing, he explained that they were digging for locust eggs. The river had been incised into a narrow valley, bordered by chalky white cliffs and a dense jungle heap of tamarisks, woven together with brambles and honeysuckles. The tamarisks were full of magpies, and there were sunken lagoons swarming with blue ducks and teal and gray coots. Large stretches of the ground looked as if it had been plowed up, but as Enkidu pointed out, it had been torn open by the tusks of a wild boar. During the night, they camped well away from this jungle, which was full of slinking jackals and hyenas and wolves, which made caterwauling noises throughout the night. The next morning, they left the tamarisk jungle behind and soon came to an area where the river was beginning to widen its banks. Hitherto, it had been only a quarter of a mile or so wide, but now it was 5 miles across, and the opposite banks had vanished into the horizon. They rode past a large mound over which a series of mud huts lay scattered, the brown dirt sprinkled with tiny shards of pottery. The river banks began to grow into cliffs, and they stopped to eat lunch near a peninsula that jutted out into the swirling muddy currents. A cleft had separated the peninsula from the land, and on top of it there lay the ruins of an ancient round tower, rising nearly 10 feet from the earth until it broke off in a serrated rift of masonry that left the tower open to the sky and the birds and the rain and the wind. A solitary hawk floated in the air high above, circling for its prey on some knoll or outcropping standing atop the promontory. The view showed Gilgamesh a white gold river cutting through a green land, crawling with sheep and fringed with tamarisk and mulberry trees. They resumed their journey over a thin crust of viridian grass that had been disrupted here and there by the cross-hatchings of mole hills and clusters of jerboa holes. Gradually, the ground became littered with stones, small ones at first, but they grew larger until they reached the size of boulders upon which lay upon the landscape like rubble from an exploded meteor. And Enkidu paused to point at some of the rocks. "My birthplace," he said, and Gilgamesh wasn't sure if he was making a joke or was serious, but he stared for a while longer at the suspicious fragments, wondering. The river traced an arc that curved west, then rounded north beneath a metal sky. In the distance, the bottom edge of the sky met a black line of rubble, and as they approached, the line became a solid wall of buttressed mud brick. They rode up to this cyclopean wall and paused outside its gate, which yawned like the entrance to Kor. The wall was faded and sun-bleached and spider-webbed with cracks across its ancient surface. "It is the ancient city of Kebnuna," Gilgamesh said. "This city was built by my grandfather Enmerkar in the days when Uruk was so mighty that it had cities all over the land." Enkidu saw something on the ground and picked it up, examining it with the 3 fingers of his half hand. "What is it?" Gilgamesh asked him. "An arrowhead," Enkidu said, "made from green obsidian, very unusual and rare," and he put it away into the leather satchel he was carrying, slung over one shoulder. From this point, they left the river behind and headed due west out onto the stony green plain. The ground became a whitish, dry soil with chalky stone protrusions jutting up out of it at intervals. On the distant horizon to the north, gray mountains frosted with snow were visible as tiny blue bumps. The land rose and fell before them in slow, undulating waves, ornamented with yellow ivory villages which were composed of hundreds of beehive-shaped houses where peasants offered raisins and honey for sale at the roadside, although they gave milk and sour curds free to anyone who wanted it. At one point they went past a high, steep, round hill, the base of which was surrounded with large black stones of porous basalt, which had been sunk into the brown earth to form a ring every now and then. A rock-cut cistern full of rainwater would stand out among the fields. The hills were pocked with artificial caves for the dead. After a couple of days, they approached a village of white stone houses that had been laid out into a hollow among gray hills. The houses had been built along the banks of a sluggish river that opened up across the stony land like a wound. They followed a track that led between orchards of pistachio trees laid out into symmetrical rows in the distance. The narrow, dark spires of cypresses marked the site of a mausoleum further west beyond them, and beyond the limits of the village a chain of naked red hills led to the line of distant mountains. They stabled their donkeys at a caravansary where the village headman, a short, round merchant with an ulcerous nose, insisted upon putting them up for the night under his own roof. They followed the merchant back to his house, a perfect cube built out of blocks of hewn stone with no windows and only one door. The floor was a piece of smoothly polished stone covered with reed mats, and the walls were completely whitewashed. Each corner of the room featured a large wooden chest full of grain, and in the center of the room was a heavy stone chest, the size of a sarcophagus. Everything in the room was the color of bones. Gilgamesh and Enkidu warmed their rain-soaked clothing by the fireplace, while the headman's wife brought out a brazier with a glowing ember in it, which wove a thin spider web of light over the room. She told them to help themselves from a jar of water in the corner. The woman then set about preparing them a meal of warm cakes baked on the hearth with cream, honey, dried raisins, sour curds, and wheat baked in milk. They ate hungrily while the headman bored them with the politics of his village. Gilgamesh explained that they were on their way to the Silver Mountains to trade metals. He inquired about the presence of Eblaiots in the area, to which the man replied with a long series of complaints about the burdens of taxation which the people of the city of Ebla had levied upon his village. Gilgamesh listened politely while the sound of the rain lulled him to sleep. The following day they continued west over stony red hills, sparely furnished with the occasional fig or walnut tree, and after a while the hills flattened out into a vast plain through which the road led past hot sulfur springs, where a fountain erupted from the foot of a high rock in the distance. To the south there was a lake, and the ground became soft and marshy, populated with hordes of waterfowl, plovers, herons, ducks, which took startled flight into the gray, wet air as they approached. At the onset of nightfall, they found a place dry enough to camp, and here they pitched their tent. After a time, they began to ascend the first slopes of the foothills leading into the Cedar Mountains. These slopes were covered with glens full of oleander and pine, and then as they began the long ascent up the side of the mountain, groves of oak and wild olive trees began to swarm upon the mountain sides. They traveled for hours up and down stony ridges and soon came upon a narrow rocky glen at the base of the highest peak where streams of blue ice water came pouring down over the stones above and fed into a green lake at the bottom, which was surrounded by a grove of walnut trees. They continued over barren patches of stone protruding from the snow, and soon the white wall of the summit began to appear above them, and they maneuvered the donkeys up through large stones near the top, and as they crested a ridge at the zenith, the mountain abruptly fell away to reveal chasms and ravines full of cedar trees, sloping down toward the edge of the distant blue sea beyond. All right, moving along here to the fifth tablet. The ancient darkness of the forest primordial, consuming a huge, colossal, cavernous cave, splayed and mottled with chartreuse beams of wrecked sunlight coming down through the cedar branches that rose in archaic stacked tiers, forming dense interlocked spiderwebs of branches, and huge vertical behemoths, blocks of lignin and bark with trees so ancient they must have been built by the gods at the start of creation. The tree they were looking for, the Meju tree, was there, and Enkidu led them straight to it, an enormous albino tree with amber leaves that was taller than all the others and filled with spiders and birds and animals, and the forest was silent, save for the cry of a nightingale somewhere, and at the base of the tree a ruined shrine, a column made of porphyry that had been broken about halfway up, and huge dark violet blocks of stone littered at its base, the shrine of the war goddess Irnini. Gilgamesh commented, an older version of Inanna from the days when Uruk ruled over all, and its rule extended even so far as the cedar forest, and its race of giants of which Humbaba was the last. The tree, he said with some excitement, looks as if it was created the day Enlil split the sky god An from the earth goddess Kai, but nevertheless We will not make a name for ourselves, my friend, unless we pull it down, and that we are going to proceed to do right now. Then let's get to it, Enkidu said with some nervousness, and his breath was shooting forth from his now bearded mouth in icy carbon wisps in the frigid mountain air. But there was movement in the tree above, and something huge and gray slithered down out of the branches and said to them in a deep basso voice, "But first you will have to get past me, gentlemen." And the thing called Humbaba was 12 feet tall, with gray elephantine skin and a pair of chipped ivory tusks curling up from its mouth, and it gazed at them with ancient burning amber eyes, and it was bald and hairless, and the faint trace of a smile played upon its lips as it sized them up. "Enkidu," it said, "is that you down there?" "Humbaba, my friend, yes, it is me. Do you not remember me?" "You dare speak to me of friendship when you bring Gilgamesh here to the forest with you, Enkidu, to pull down my sacred meshu tree that Enlil specifically put me here to guard?" Gilgamesh in the splayed gloom had unsheathed his bronze axe with the ashwood handle and was creeping stealthily forward toward the ancient and mighty beast when it turned its gaze upon him and froze him so that he could not move. He had become a human tree and stood there with his axe raised as that burning amber gaze riveted him to the spot. "Humbaba, I have brought you something," said Enkidu, reaching inside his leather satchel. "I remember how much you like precious stones, and I have brought you some to add to your collection." And he poured them out into his one good hand: chalcedony, onyx, agate, beryl, lapis lazuli, carnelian. "You've brought stones?" the creature said, and removed its gaze from Gilgamesh to sit down upon its haunches and hold out its enormous three-fingered hand as Enkidu poured the stones into it. And the creature said, "I already have jasper, and this beryl has a flaw in it. But what have we here? Ho ho! You brought me a piece of green obsidian. I've never seen that before. Well done, Enkidu, if I may say so. Well done, my friend, well done." And as the ancient archaic beast sat pawing through the stones in his hand, Gilgamesh the warrior raised his bronze axe above his head and swung it in a circle as though he were about to cut down a tree and let the axe fly toward the creature's skull. But the axe merely bounced off it, and Humbaba said distractedly, What was that, an acorn?" Gilgamesh, feeling the ancient dark rising fury flooding through him now, his brow darkened, and his pulse beating blood coursed through his veins. "Humbaba," he said today, "the vultures and the jackals are going to have you. Shamash, I call upon your ancient hatred of the dark things and the fell shadow creatures that dwell in the world's murk and gloom far from your reach." Humbaba looked up at Enkidu and said to him, "Your friend seems to be angry about something, but he needs to speak in Akkadian if he is going to talk to me. You know I don't speak Sumerian, Enkidu." All at once a wind began to blow through the forest, lightly at first, like the first breezes that announce the coming of a storm, and only the wind chimes can be heard, and the bark of a distant dog, and then as the winds grow stronger, they bend the branches of the trees backwards as the leaves begin to rustle their chorus. Gilgamesh had drawn his bronze sickle blade, and he stepped forward with it, feeling a gathering strength and fury from the winds sent to him by Shamash. But Humbaba seemed unaware of him and unconcerned. "Humbaba," Enkidu said, as the wind rushed through the forest and began to pick up speed, "I have also brought another stone for you." "And what kind of a stone is that?" Humbaba muttered without looking up, and Enkidu shouted, "Bronze!" and then leapt up onto Humbaba's left knee and stabbed his bronze blade into the creature's left eye, while Gilgamesh simultaneously leaped up onto the creature's right knee and rammed the blade of his sickle sword into the beast's throat, and the fell thing of darkness abruptly leapt to its feet, attempting to scream, but all that came out of its mouth was a loud gurgling sound as a jet of blood began squirting unstoppably like a fountain, and it tried to pull Enkidu's blade from its eye, and fell over backwards, squirming and crawling and writhing upon the forest floor as the blood drained out of its enormous skeleton, and soon it had stopped moving and stopped breathing, and the life that it had thought would never be parted from it had gone away. "Quickly," Enkidu said, "we must remove its head before Enlil knows what we have done if he hasn't already seen it." And both he and Gilgamesh set to work sawing through the tendons and ligaments and the spinal column in the thing's neck until the tusked head came loose, and the two of them held it up, proud of their handiwork. "And now," Gilgamesh said, "let us make short work of this tree." And they began hacking away with their axes until the enormous, monstrous giant of a prehistoric tree collapsed, tilted, and fell over with an impossible cracking sound that resounded through the woods and terrified everything that lived within it for miles, and the earth thundered and shook and moved as the thing fell. Exhausted, sweating, and out of breath, Gilgamesh nevertheless smiled at his friend. "Nice work," he said. That is what I call a job well done. Come, he said, let us hack up the wood and make sledges to carry pieces of the tree back down the mountain with us to the river, and then we will transform the sledges into rafts and take them with us down river. It will be much quicker for us going home than the arduous journey it took for us over the weeks to ascend this mountain and slay this devil. My friend Gilgamesh said excitedly, we have done it. It will be famous throughout the world. We will be famous throughout the world for this deed. No one will ever forget us. We have inscribed our names in the name of Shamash along with us into history. Our deed will never be forgotten, my friend. My friend, we have become immortal. The 6th tablet. Warm day, blue sky, pink flowers of tamarisk trees in bloom. Gilgamesh knee-deep in the chocolate river in a shady cove arbored by dense palm trees. Garbed in a kilt of purple linen, chest bare, skin shiny with cedar oil, wearing a necklace of lapis lazuli beads with a gold medallion shell inlay of a Kusaraku bull man. Ducks and teal and coots in groups flocking in and out of the yellow-green reeds in the miniature forests along the bank. Gilgamesh had laid out near a reed mat fence a white linen blanket upon which his freshly cleaned weapons gleamed. 2 spears, a bronze socket axe, the sickle sword that he had used to kill Humbaba, and he was presently finishing up washing a limestone mace head. A breeze suddenly lightening the fronds, and the goddess Inanna approached him, there wearing a blue linen robe and a necklace of carnelian. Gilgamesh, she said, marveling at his body, come be you my bridegroom, and I shall be your bride, shall we not? And he looked up and smiled grimly at her. We shall not, he said. What man would be a suitable partner for you? I remember very well the fate of poor Demutzi when you went down to Irkala and he had to be dragged down by Galu demons to take your place. Do you think I would wish such a fate for myself? Behind Inanna, a group of bald young men with henna tattoos inscribed upon their arms, banging drums made out of pelican pouches, and going into ecstatic Inanna trance dances, singing the joys and the ecstasies of the gala priests of the mistress of the great above, and of lore, of love, war, fucking, and killing. They shuddered and spasmed as though orgasms had been unleashed all throughout their bodies. But, she said, taken aback, you cannot refuse me, for I will make you a chariot of lapis lazuli, pulled by lions. I will adorn you and sprinkle you with cedar oil, and mark kohl around your eyes, and burn cedarwood incense, and we will build a rosewood bed in the shape of a lion, and we will love one another in the temple, and use the wood from the felled meshu tree to build a new throne in the Japar, and one in the palace, the En and the Entu together, and ruling in the name of the great goddess, and become like the horse whose will you broke, so that it must be domesticated and can no longer run wild, or the hoopoe bird whose wing you shattered, or poor Sukalatuda, who had his way with you, and you sent plagues over the cities looking to find him, and then when Enki helped you find him, you turned him into a mere shepherd? Or Ishulanu, who refused to touch your vulva, and so you made him into a dwarf? No thanks, and went back to cleaning his weapons in a cloud of mosquitoes. Furious, the goddess ascended straight to the heaven of her father An and her mother Antu. She found them in their palace, where Antu was seated upon a carved rosewood stool, while an attendant braided her gray hair, and another dipped an ivory pin into a series of cockle shells full of colored pigments, which he was painting onto her face, and a third attendant applied perfume to her neck from an ostrich egg ornamented with strips of gold and black shell inlay. Her father was studying blue lapis tablets of the maze laid out on tables when she went into him and demanded that he turn over to her the bowl of heaven to unleash it upon Gilgamesh to destroy him for his insolence. And her father said, but what did you do to provoke him, my dear? I did no such thing, and he heaped a string of abuses upon me. If you don't give me the bull, father, I shall raise the dead up from Irkala and unleash them to eat the flesh of the living. You know I can do it. I can call upon my sister to disgorge them. Irkala is too full as it is anyway. Well, said An, still poring over his tablets, we can't have that now, can we? Here, then is the leash. And he handed it to her, and she went to get the bull out of the stables and sent it down to the earth to the city of Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, meanwhile, were still celebrating their triumph in the cedar forest. They had hung the head of Humbaba at the main entrance to the city, and now they were drinking beer through reed straws in a dark windowless tavern lit only by torches and candles, where men sat on cushions upon the floor, some lying about with harem-to prostitutes, the air dense with opium smoke and the dark, sweet aroma of burning hashish. They were laughing when Gilgamesh's advisor Lugalgabanga came in, frantic. I apologize, Your Greatness, for interrupting, but I must speak with you at once. There's a panic in the city. A panic, said Gilgamesh. What sort of a panic on a day like this? How can there be a panic? "Celebrate with us, my good man. Come over, have a beer. It is very good. Or some fine Mari wine, the best in the world. What's the matter with you troubling us on a day like this?" "But a gigantic bull, sire, has been let loose upon the earth, the bull of heaven, and it is terrorizing the countryside. Perhaps it is a mashkim or an udag let loose by some sorcerer's spell." The brothers looked at each other and smiled. "A gigantic bull? Let us get our weapons." And they went out through the south gate, carrying with them spears, bronze axes, and 5-pronged fishing harpoons. They loitered near a cluster of abandoned beige farmers' huts, waiting for the beast to show up. Enkidu sitting casually upon a pile of broken mud bricks from a collapsed wall, watching the furtive movement of the ash-gray doves, and they were surrounded by discarded, rotting farmers' instruments, a splintery cedar plow, a tarnished hoe, a threshing sledge, and a row of leather harnesses hung from pegs on a chipped wall. And then it came. They felt the rumbling of the beast's steps before they saw it, and looked at each other, bronze tools on a work table beginning to vibrate, and they heard a thunderous bellow like the sound of an angry bull with the volume and power of a clap of thunder resounding over the dim and distant mountains, approaching with the fury of a desert storm about to be unleashed upon them. They hid behind a stack of bricks and peered out at the date palm orchard in front of the city, which was completely abandoned, for everyone had disappeared into the city, and you could mark the approach of the beast through the palm trees with the explosive, throttled burst of the pigeons that erupted just ahead of its passage. And as the beast came into view, it was huge, a massive black bull's head with chipped yellow horns, and it gazed down with oily, iridescent eyes, rows of palms parted like grass before an elephant as its hooves came down with crushing weight upon houses and fields, its head scanning from side to side as it looked for things to eat, birds scattering noisily into the slate blue sky at its passage. "Oh, this is good," Gilgamesh said, and Enkidu yelled up at it, "Ho there, great one!" The beast was about to take a step, but it paused to look at them and lowered its horns in a huge sweeping arc toward Enkidu, but its head was blocked by the stalks of the palm trees, and it got frustrated as they became caught in a tangle of trees, leaves, and chaos, and its bellowing roar was fearsome to hear. It made your ears vibrate with the volume and power of it. "Great one, you will have to do better than that," Enkidu shouted up at it with a smile. The beast gazed at Enkidu with filmy, mucus-covered eyes and snorted as a cloud of flies the size of bats with metallic green bodies hovered around its head. The bull smelled like a dead thing, like something that had been left out to rot, for it soaked the air around it with the stench of rot and decay. "Great one, look, there are rivers of water here all around you to drink up." Gilgamesh crossed to one of the irrigation ditches where he waved at the bull with both of his arms. The creature's nostrils flared as it began to sniff the ground, realizing that there was in fact water everywhere, and it bent down and began to drink thirstily from the canals, soaking up all the water in them, its onyx hide marbled with russet patches of skin as though it had been sewn together out of different textiles. The hide was pitted and gouged with scars where others had tried and failed to bring the great beast down. Gilgamesh and Enkidu circled the animal on opposite sides, passing close to its mud-encrusted hooves. The creature seemed to take no notice of them as it sloshed down the water, and did not even notice when they began to hurl harpoons at it. And the harpoons were tied to ropes that they used to scale either side of its rear flanks. The two warriors were nearly swept from its spine by palm fronds as it backed up and tried to rid itself of these pests. They buried spears deep into its flesh and hung on tightly. But the bull stopped and stood staring at the city wall. It had noticed something, a glint of metal perhaps, and it was stamping its right foot. Suddenly it wheeled and ran back in the opposite direction of the city, giving itself room, then turned and headed straight for the wall where Inanna stood from the ramparts, watching as it did so, carefully moving out of its way as it slammed into the wall and sent city soldiers flying in all directions. Although the wall withstood the impact, its horns went right through the mud bricks, but a large wound had been ripped into it, and a number of bricks loose teeth popped out, the first true and real and deep assault upon the mighty masterwork of the walls built by Gilgamesh. And now the aggression of the goddess had taken on avataric form in the bull's body, and it was directed at him, at Gilgamesh. The goddess was using the bull as her puppet to destroy him out of the deep black bile of her hatred of him for scorning her. But Gilgamesh and Enkidu hung on tightly to its back as the bull yanked itself loose from the wall and was circling back around for another assault, its hide covered in yellow dust and powdered brick, long ropey strands of blood hanging from its jaw, one of its eyes a pulpy, ragged mess. It bellowed frighteningly and then began to charge, the thunder of its hooves incredible as an earthquake, as it slammed again into the wall. This time the impact caused the wall to give way, and the bull punched right through it, and its body collapsed in a shower of bricks and red dust, and it lay there splayed and groaning, its back legs thrusting out blindly as it attempted to right itself half in and half out of the city, which was now like an exposed animal open to the heavens, with tiny cube-shaped houses for its internal organs that were now being ruptured. Inanna had gone crazy, for the city had been built for her. It was her home, and now she was trying to destroy the very exoskeleton that had been built by her human slaves to encase and ensheathe her and protect her from the aggressions of the other gods like Zababa of Kish, who had come to destroy her on more than one occasion. But now Inanna, standing on the top of the wall with a group of soldiers, had gone mad with fury, and she gazed down at the bull, willing it to get up, willing its damaged body to extract itself free from the mess of the brick rubble and continue to inflict damage on her city. Not the city that this mere human mortal called Gilgamesh was trying to take away from her to make it his own and to cut her out of the loop. It was something that she could not stand, such ingratitude from a mortal whose cock she had been willing to suck and fuck all he wanted, and now this monster that she had called down from heaven to destroy the work of Gilgamesh and all the forebears of the solar dynasty of Utu. Enkidu wasted no time, for he was on the bull's rear, and he jumped down to the dirt and saw the creature's large, leathery scrotum, and he raised his spear and stabbed it right through the scrotal sac again and again and again, and the creature roared and got to its feet in a shower of scraping bricks and heaps of mountains of moving, shifting rubble that it kept sliding in and out of, as it could not get any purchase upon the firm ground with a mess that had been made out of the wall. A view from high up in the air would show a giant oval-shaped city with a huge black animal thrust into its side like the spear wound of Longinus in the side of the mystical body of Christ from a later eon. At the same time, Gilgamesh was up on his feet, standing between its shoulder blades, and he brought the spear he was holding right down between the shoulder blades, and as the beast began to shudder into its death throes, he brought his axe down, clump into the back of its skull, and it expired with an exhalation of stale, shuddering, fetid air as its sides stopped heaving and simply became motionless. Gilgamesh jumped down from the beast's back, and he used his axe to hack at its rib cage, tearing it open to rip out the heart which he offered to Shamash, and he could see Inanna up on the ramparts watching, brows furrowed in fury, and he laughed and motioned to Enkidu to look up, and when Enkidu saw her, he laughed too and said, "Wait, I'll cut you a nice piece, dearie," and he began hacking at the bull's back thigh with his axe until the leg came loose, and he raised it over his head and hurled it in her general direction, though it didn't go very far, and fell into the dirt like a side of beef, whereupon a gaggle of huge green metallic flies with swollen, bulbous, polyoptic eyes settled upon it and began to devour it and lay their eggs all over it. "That's your cut," he said, and they both laughed as they proceeded to hack the great beast into pieces, its blood splashing merrily everywhere, and chunks of meat and beef and chips of bone and flesh and sinews came apart, and Enkidu began eating chunks of it, raw, gorging himself on the meat as though he had decivilized himself and reverted back to the status of a wild man thing, which lived on raw meat and fresh blood, and he became a human worm crawling through the bull's intestines and its guts getting inside of it as though he were a bullman Kusharaku embryo that it failed to give birth to, and now he was stuck inside of it, gnawing his way through the flesh, muscle, bones, sinews, cartilage of the great beast, and the blood, and Gilgamesh watching him standing, laughing, unbelieving. "Enkidu, you are making a mess of yourself," he said, and Enkidu looked up, blood streaming from his body, and nodded. "I know," he said with delight, and continued to worm his way through the carcass like something no god had ever made or ever could make. It was so ungodly and inhuman, a beast from another world, but both he and the bull had come from the heavens. They shared a divine kinship that at some level was beyond the mere cellular fusion of matrices forming at the genetic level, but was rather shot through with God, with the divine transubstantiative power that fused Enkidu and the bull to become a Kasharku bullman thing creature. Gilgamesh was surrounded by his craftsmen, and they swarmed all about him as though they were human flies, and he gave them mind food to eat, plans and blueprints and maps and charts and diagrams about what to do with the architecture of the bull's body, about where the horns would go as a shrine for his father Lugabanda, and the hooves would become relics of divinity to be worshipped with their own altars, and the guts would be made into tools, leather sacks, and containers for liquids and foods, and the bull's skull, the bucranium, could be hung on the city walls as its emblem, and the craftsmen were hungry to eat all of this up, and they devoured it, human flies. And people, the city dwellers, not primordial any longer, but the death of the bull reminded them, at some deep level, brought them back down to the caves and the mammoths, stirred deep unconscious memories inside of them, and they stood atop the walls and watched with envy as Gilgamesh and Enkidu destroyed the animal, and Enkidu ate it while Gilgamesh drew plans for transforming it into a work of art. And Gilgamesh looked up at them and waved. "Is your Lugal not amazing?" he yelled, and they all applauded at the regression to the biomechanics of Stone Age life, a way of life long since rendered obsolete by the erection and existence of the exoskeletal containing walls that the Great Mother in her latest incarnation had tried to destroy. Gilgamesh and Enkidu spent the night back in the tavern drinking beer out of reed straws and also drinking bull's blood out of huge pitoi and pouring it over their bodies while smoking hashish and opium and drinking Mari wine and Sumerian beer and laughing and carrying on. They fell asleep on the cushions of the floor of the tavern, and no one bothered them to ask them to leave, for they were heroes, and Gilgamesh, for one last time, the last time of his entire life, would become their great hero, the great Lugal who had saved the city. So they let them sleep. But in the middle of the night, Enkidu awoke from a dream, and he shoved Gilgamesh to try and awaken him, and Gilgamesh woke up, though groggy, and he could barely comprehend what Enkidu was saying, but what he was saying was, "My friend, why have the gods gathered together in council